This is because energy transfer between one trophic level and another is very inefficient. And the upshot of that is that you end up with very little biomass at the higher trophic levels, at least most of the time. That's because basically for every 3 grams of salamander tissue you have in a particular biome, you have to have 1,000 grams of plant matter supporting those 3 grams. And this should jive with your intuition pretty well. You know, if you go out into a forest, for example, you will see a tremendous number of plants. If you look closely, you'll see a reasonable number of things like fungi that eat dead plants. You'll see a reasonable number of herbivores, insects, for example, that eat plant matter, but not nearly as much as you'll see plants. And if you start looking for small carnivores, things that eat the primary consumers, you'll find very few of those, maybe some birds. And if you start looking for things like, say, mountain lions that eat other carnivores, they are very, very rare. This is largely why. It's largely because very few organisms or very little biomass at a given trophic level can exist per unit area because energy transfer is so poor between one trophic level and the other. Okay, so what you usually see when you go out into an ecosystem is a biomass pyramid that looks like this. In a forest, tremendous amounts of plant matter, very small biomass of primary consumers, very, very small biomass of secondary consumers. In a grassland, the plant matter is much more digestible. The efficiency with which biomass can be taken up by primary consumers is much higher, and so in grasslands you tend to have a higher biomass of herbivores. That in turn supports a higher biomass per unit area of carnivores. As I mentioned before, in some ecosystems, the standing biomass does not reflect the energy flow through a particular trophic level. For example, in the open ocean, the primary producers here, the algae and the photosynthetic plankton, are really digestible. There's no biomass in the producer level that can't be eaten and assimilated, or mostly assimilated at least, by consumers. And so there's a tremendous amount of consumers going around and snapping up all of that biomass. These consumers are quite long-lived. We're talking about things like fish or maybe sea turtles. The herbivores of the sea can be extremely long-lived, and so that biomass tends to stay, that energy rather, tends to stay locked up in their biomass for a very long time. Energy flow through this trophic level is slow. So when you look in the ocean, you actually do not see very many producers. Nonetheless, there's a tremendous amount of energy passing through the producer level. It's just that it passes through so quickly into the primary consumer level that you see very little standing producer biomass. Okay, so not only is the biomass of top predators limited by the efficiency with which energy is transferred up a food chain or up through a food web, but the length of the food chain is limited. And you can imagine that if you had some super predator that only fed on, say, mountain lions, it would have a very rough time finding enough food. It would have to range so widely in order to find enough mountain lions to eat that you could not sustain a viable population of it. In fact, it's likely that a single organism would expend so much energy running around looking for mountain lions that it would die. It basically wouldn't be able to keep its energy budget balanced. Even if you could, though, these top predators tend to have very, very small population sizes. And so they tend to be very vulnerable to extinction. That's something that we'll get into when we talk about conservation biology at the end of this course. One other thing that I'd like to mention about food chains is that there's a such thing as what's called top-down control and there's a such thing as bottom-up control. Bottom-up control occurs when the amount of biomass that's being generated at a particular trophic level is what determines the amount of biomass that you get on the next level up. So for example, a bottom-up food chain would look something like this. If you increase the amount of nutrients that are available to this ecosystem, that increases the amount of phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are plankton that use photosynthesis to make energy. In turn, those phytoplankton are eaten by zooplankton, and so indirectly adding nutrients to this ecosystem causes the zooplankton to increase in numbers. That in turn feeds more of these planktivore fish, these secondary consumers, and they in turn feed more of these tertiary consumers. Notice that this effect gets weaker and weaker as you go up the food chain. And this is largely because of the inefficiencies involved in going up each step. So if you dump a lot of nutrients into a lake, you're going to see a huge increase in the amount of phytoplankton, assuming that the food chain is under bottom-up control. You'll see a slight increase in the biomass in top predators. There are also what are called top-down controls on food chains. And this is what occurs when the biomass of this level, for example, this trophic level, is determined largely by the number of individuals on the amount of biomass at the trophic level above it. So in other words, when people go and they stock lakes with top predators like white bass, what that does is it drives down the number of plankton-eating fish. Because there are fewer plankton-eating fish, the number of zooplankton goes up because they aren't being eaten by as much. Because there are more phytoplankton, or sorry, because there are more of these zooplankton, these primary consumers, the producers go down in numbers, and so you get more free nutrients kind of floating around in the lake. So with bottom-up control, everything follows the direction that the bottommost level of the food chain takes. With top-down control, you get these alternating sort of zigzags in the direction that things trend, going from the top down. Effects tend to weaken as they pass through multiple links. This is true, by the way, of all interactions among species, but it's probably most important when you're thinking about food chains. So when you increase the amount of nutrients that are present in the ecosystem, you're going to see a big response by, say, the phytoplankton. You're going to see a much smaller response by fish that are predators. Similarly, if you stock a lake with fish-eating fish, you're going to see a big difference, a big drop in the planktivorous fish, but you may not see much of a big effect in the phytoplankton. And there are a lot of reasons why this is the case. So for example, because organisms don't always feed on the same trophic level, or don't always feed on a single trophic level, the effect isn't very clean when you're talking about a top-down effect. With this predaceous fish, for example, may reduce the number of planktivorous fish, but it might also eat herbivorous crustaceans that feed on phytoplankton. And so, yes, these organisms at this trophic level are getting a release or an escape from some of these predators, but they're also getting eaten by more of these predaceous fish. So the effect that you get by adding these predaceous fish is dampened by the fact they don't all feed on the same trophic level. There are a lot of other reasons why these effects get dampened. The real take-home message that you need to know is that they do, although I do want you to think about potential reasons why this happens. One thing that is generally true is that trophic cascades tend to be weaker in terrestrial ecosystems. Usually when you add like top predators or remove top predators from an aquatic ecosystem, you get a gigantic response. When you remove top predators from terrestrial ecosystems, you do get a response, but it's not quite as dramatic. Still, it can be substantial. In areas where there are a lot of human beings, like basically most of North America, large predators have been exterminated. And so you see a dramatic shift in the plant community. This is being seen in all sorts of ecosystems. The one that's shown here is actually an ecosystem in Mexico. In areas where top predators have been removed, you get basically no plant understory because the number of herbivores that you get in this ecosystem goes up to the point where they destroy all of the low-lying seedlings and young plants.